Ruh-roh. All right, we're live.
By heavens.
Thank you so much for joining Operation Adulting today with our Seneca Village presentation. I would definitely love to introduce Diana Roth, a professor emerita at City College and CUNY Graduate Center. And Diana, you specialize in New York City specifically, archaeology of New York City. Do you mind telling us a little bit more about that?
I grew up in New York City. I was born in New York City, and I've spent my adult life studying New York City. Sometimes I think I should get out of town and go somewhere else, but I haven't. So I've been interested in studying the Dutch who were here in the 17th century, the English in the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, all of this stuff, and of course including Seneca Village, what we're talking about today.
Amazing. Sounds incredible. And so I know that you and Nan have met due to Seneca Village, or maybe knew each other before?
We knew each other before that.
Graduate school.
Oh, amazing. I wish I didn't know that. But Nan Rothschild, you work specifically with the American Southwest and New York City. Why those two distinct regions in particular?
They're both places that I love. They're very different. I like Diana, I was born in New York. I grew up in New York. I've never really lived anywhere else. But I started doing some field school in the Southwest, and I just love the geography and the sense of vastness in the Southwest, which you don't get in New York City. And then I started taking students to the field, and I've written about the Southwest. And so it feels a little schizophrenic to have two such different interests, but it works.
And I feel that there's probably like certain very, very unique aspects of each region that you just can't find in the opposite, I'm sure. And so just briefly reading your biographies, you two actually like release a book? It's called The Archaeology of American Cities.
Yes.
How is it working on that?
We actually finished that book.
Yeah.
And it, in fact, came out in 14. Was that it, Nan?
Right. And then a paperback edition about a year or so later. We've also worked together before. We worked certainly on the Seneca Village site report. We've worked on other archaeological projects. We find it very comfortable writing together.
Nice, because I feel like that's usually the most difficult portion of writing with someone, is making sure that you kind of speak a similar language and you understand each other.
Finding a voice that everybody can use is always hard, yeah.
Right.
But we seem to come by it pretty naturally. Do you think that's fair to say, Nan?
I do.
That's incredible. All right, so I know we have both of your presentations. Diana, if you'd like to start yours.
I think that would be good.
Amazing. I'm going to hide off to the side now.
Okay. Haha, there we are. Okay, as I think everybody knows, today what we're going to talk about is Seneca Village, and we're focused on particularly an archaeological project that we've both been working on since the early 1990s. And what we're going to do is, first of all, begin by talking about what is Seneca Village, what was Seneca Village, and then we want to describe the project that we've been doing. The project uses both historical documents, and it also uses archaeological techniques and artifacts, things that archaeologists find. And I'm going to talk about basically a lot of the documentary, the historical maps and things like that we found about Seneca Village, and then Nan is going to talk about the actual dig itself. Seneca Village, as I think most people know, was an African-American community that was founded in 1827. And if we think of 1827 in the context of the African-American experience in New York, what we know that 1627 means is when abolition came to New York State. So in other words, Seneca Village, a free Black community, was founded in the shadow of abolition in the shadow of slavery. And it was a 19th century predominantly African American community located in what is today Central Park. By the 1850s, it was the home of almost 300 people, around 2/3 of whom were African American, and the rest were mostly Irish. You have to remember this is the time of the famine, the potato famine in Ireland, and there were a lot of Irish immigrants coming to New York and other places too, obviously Canada, Australia, et cetera, et cetera. Seneca Village was a very permanent community. It had 3 churches and a school when it was finally destroyed. It was destroyed in 1857 because the city decided to put Central Park in the area where Seneca Village was. So what the city did was it took the land, as the city does now, the state does now, the federal government now, took the land through the right of eminent domain. In other words, the idea was that Central Park would be equally valuable for the general public, more so than it was for just a small community like Seneca Village and the communities of other people who lived in Central Park. There were almost 2,000 people living in Central Park at the time the city seized the land. And as I said before, only about 300 of them were living in Seneca Village. One of the things, though, that the city did to make it, quote unquote, okay to take the land away from the people who lived there is they denigrated the area's residents. In other words, the people who lived there, and described them as impoverished and dangerous. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So as I said before, the documents and the artifacts show us that Seneca Village was a stable, mostly middle-class community with considerable ethnic and racial diversity, whose members forged lasting social bonds with each other. We have to remember Seneca Village lasted from the 1820s to the 1850s. We're talking about 30 years, and we're talking about a generation. And we have situations where people grew up in Seneca Village and lived their adult lives there, too. So in other words, it was a permanent, stable community.
Diana, I'm sorry to interrupt. Did we have any slides that are matching the information that you're sharing with us?
I'm sorry. Yeah, as I go on, I will do that.
I can also.
I'm trying to start the slides now.
Gotcha.
Okay. After the 1850s, Seneca Village was pretty much forgotten by the public. And until 1992, when this book was published called The Park and the People. And the book is about Central Park, the making of Central Park, and the history of Central Park. And the people who wrote it, Betsy Blackmore and Roy Rosenzweig, devoted a chapter to Seneca Village in it. And it was a marvelously researched chapter. And when I first became aware of it, I was extremely excited at the possibility that there could be an archaeological site left in Central Park where Seneca Village had been. Nan and I had worked together for on various projects over the years, and it was just automatic that I would ask her to work with me on this project, and it worked out really well. We also worked with Cynthia Copeland, who was then of the New York Historical Society. Excuse me. So this was the period when we began, in other words, in the early 1990s, 1993, I would say. And just to let you know where Seneca Village is, this is Manhattan Island, the center of New York. This is Central Park, the center of New York, if you don't mind my putting it that way. This is the reservoir, for those of you who know the city. And this is the Museum of Natural History. And right here, between the Museum of Natural History and the reservoir, but in what is now the park, is where Seneca Village was. And I'm going to be showing you some old maps, too, where Seneca Village appears. And this is going to be the first one. This is a map of New York City by Colton, and it dates to 1836. So at this point, Seneca Village had been around for 10 years. And I think you can see that down here, where the gray is a darker gray, that is where the actual city was at that point. That was the urban area. And if we look up here, there are two little rectangles, which I think maybe you can see there. I hope it's big enough for you to see. And just to the top of them, which is actually west of them, is where Seneca Village was. So what you can see is that Seneca Village, when it was created, was quite a ways, like 3 miles outside of New York City. It was a separate little community.
I hate to interrupt, Diana, and I feel that you're pointing out some very important areas.
And you can't
see it on our side unless you share your screen. If you're comfortable doing that.
Absolutely. I don't know how to do it, however.
It'll be those 4 buttons that are at the top of the screen.
Yes.
The third one. I believe if you hover over it, it'll say turn screen share on.
Will you allow the event to see your screen? Allow. I just pressed on allow.
No, it says turn screen share on.
Maybe I'm pressing the wrong.
You have those 4 blue buttons.
Yeah, I did that. I did turn screen share on. Now nothing's happening. Anyone have any ideas?
I'm looking at it. That's odd. Oh, there it goes.
There's someone playing the violin.
That's my homepage, I'm afraid.
Oh. So should I click on the image that we were trying to show?
Yes, if this is your screen.
It's my screen. I put screen share on. I should close out of it, right?
Yes, please.
Okay. Sorry.
You're fine.
I don't know. I'm at a standstill here.
All right, let's do, I think you would go back to turn screen share on.
That's the third button up the top. Yeah, turn screen share on. And I click on it and now nothing happens.
Even if you try to go to slides on the right side of the screen.
Which is highlighted. Yeah.
Got it. Just as you said it. And it's still not responding. What about slide further to the right?
Yeah, I can only see the slide presentation smaller set. I'm going to give everyone that's watching a poll to fill out right now. And the question is, where did you first hear about Seneca Village? While we work on getting our presentation up, let's see. Diana,
I see now we're starting.
Okay.
Now we're back with a full screen with the map. And I'll do screen share again, try it?
Yes, let's try it here.
Diana, do you have many more slides that you want to highlight? Show spots on them?
I think that would be maybe we could just go on and not worry about it.
Yeah, totally. That's fine.
Because otherwise we'll spend all of our time doing this. So shall I pick up where I left off?
Yes, please.
Okay. So what I was showing you was this Colton slide. The city is way down at the tip. I hope you can see that. Seneca Village is in the middle of the slide. You can see my arrow, I assume, more or less where I'm pointing. So as you can see, Seneca Village was quite a few miles outside of town at that point. And then one of the questions that we had was, why did people settle Seneca Village? What did they want to do? Well, we think that one of the things they wanted to do was to get away from downtown, get away from the city. And the reason why they wanted to do that was because there was an enormous discrimination against people of color, particularly African Americans. And remember, this was the time of emancipation, abolition, and a lot of the whites were very nervous about what was going to happen once the African Americans had gotten their freedom and could vote and things like that. Another reason why we think that they founded Seneca Village had to do with just that, with voting. The New York State Constitution in 1821 had added an amendment to itself that said that if you were an African American male and wanted to vote, you had to own at least $250 worth of property. And the land that people owned in Seneca Village allowed them to meet that condition. So a very high percentage of the people who lived in Seneca Village were able to vote, as opposed to African Americans living in other parts of the city. As part of our project, we wanted to find out everything we could about the people in Seneca Village. So we looked at all sorts of records. Don't worry, we don't need to read this. But what this is a copy of the page from the census that came out in 1855. And we always think of the census today. It's decennial, comes out every 10 years, and it comes out on the decade. We just had one that was finished now, 2020, and 2000. 1990, et cetera, et cetera. But there was also a census that was done in the 19th and early 20th century just for New York State, and that's what this is a copy of. What was good about this census was that it allowed us to link names of people who we knew lived in Seneca Village from looking at the census to where actually they lived. So this is a census. It lists the head of every household the way the ones we have today do, the names of all the children, how old the children were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing that people did in light of the city taking over Seneca Village was they made a lot of maps. And I have to say, archaeologists love maps. This is a topographical map. It shows the rock outcroppings. There's another big one over there. It shows us the streets, and of course it shows us the houses. And it shows us where people had gardens and things like that, had land that was planted. And this was another map. This was the map that was really the answer to an archaeologist's prayer, because this is called the Gardner Sage map. And this is the map was made like an atlas to cover the whole area of Central Park. And this is part of what Seneca Village was. And it gave you all sorts of information. Who owned the land? See these little properties here? And who was living in the houses. If it was the same person who owned it, or if it was someone different, they gave the name of that person. And it allowed us to plug people in from the census and from other things into where they were on the ground, which of course is what archaeologists like. There were also articles about Seneca Village and the other people who lived in Central Park at that time. And this is an excerpt from what is today the New York Times. Then it was called the New York Daily Times. And one of the things that it says, which of course I know you can't read, but talking about this community within the limits of Central Park lies a neat little settlement known as the N-word village. The Ebon inhabitants after whom the village is called present a pleasing contrast in their habits and the appearance of their dwellings to the Celts and the shanties in the lower parts of the park. It is incredibly condescending and really quite offensive for us to read today, and really unbelievable that this would be in the newspaper of record, as the Times likes to call itself. But the idea was, let me just finish talking about the paper for a second. But the idea was, if these were people who were not quote unquote civilized, then it was okay to take their land. So we had an idea of where the houses were from the Sage map, and we had an idea of other things that were going on in the village, where rock outcroppings were and things like that from the VLA map. And then what we decided to do after that was to take soil corings. And we had Suanna Selby, the woman who you see leaning over with a corer, something that you screw into the ground to get a sample of soil. And we did this in order to see if there were intact remains of Seneca Village left in the ground. So in other words, what we were looking for was soil that had formed there, rather than soil that had been brought in as landfill or something like that. And we found enough areas where it did seem that soil had brought in that we decided to go on with the project. It looked, in other words, as though it might be an archaeological site, what we were concerned about. And then a year later, this is now 2005, we did ground penetrating radar on the site. And the goal with ground penetrating radar is that you send a pulse of radar down into the ground, and it's reflected back by objects that pulse of radar encounters. And depending on how long it takes for it to get back, you can talk about how dense the soil is this soil the same as the soil over there, all of that kind of thing. And what we were interested in looking for were things like that archaeologists call features. In other words, the foundations of buildings, trash pits, things like that. We would be able to pick up with the ground penetrating radar. And again, we found some very exciting possibilities. In other words, the radar doesn't tell you, oh yes, look at that, it's the floor of a house. Instead, it tells you it's something that could be the floor of a house, or it could be the floor of a house that was abandoned in 1955, 100 years later than what we were interested in. So after we did the ground penetrating radar, we ended up with these 6 areas that had exciting things going on in them. And this was from looking at the radar. And in the meantime, we had been trying to get permission to actually do excavations in Seneca Village. And after we did the ground penetrating radar, we had a long gap in being able to do anything at Seneca Village, because the next step for us was to dig. That was where we were, but we didn't have permission. And it took us from 2005 to 2011 to get permission to be able to dig in Central Park. I think the position of the Parks Department was that if they gave permission to us, everybody, I don't think this is true, but other people might want to dig in Central Park too. However, what we did was we persevered, and we also got people to help us. We had an advisory board, and they were extremely helpful in getting us to get permission from the Parks Department and the Central Park Conservancy to be able to dig in the park. So finally, in 2010, 2011, it looked as though we were going to get permission. We applied for money from the National Science Foundation and got it. And we assembled the crew, whom you see here, including ourselves. And we went out into the field in 2011. And I think Nan is going to now take up the story.
Okay.
If we can.
Sorry. I just got a flash from Adobe, which interfered. Okay. So we started with a crew of students from all over the city who had never, all except one, had never done any archaeology. And they turned out to be the most amazing students. They never complained when it was hot, when it was dirty, when they had to work long hours, when they had to backfill, which I will tell you about in a minute. And they were just terrific. There were 10 students, 2 field supervisors, and then Cynthia and Diana and I. We had certain goals, and the first, of course, was to test whether the ground penetrating radar had been truthful in identifying what seemed to be important areas. The second was to get a sample, which is what archaeologists want, is to dig, of the material culture left by the people of Seneca Village, assuming that we could find deposits that would have that kind of material. And then thirdly, we wanted to address some research questions that we had about the village and life in the village. We also had some ground rules, which were, in a sense, restrictions. We only had 8 weeks in the field, excuse me, and 4 weeks in the lab with these students. We were not allowed to excavate more than 25 1-meter excavation units, which was really quite a limitation. The really challenging part was that every Friday night, the students had to backfill, that is, put all the dirt back in the hole that they had been working on. And then on Monday, they had to open it again. Now, in most archaeology, most seasoned archaeological crews, if you had to do that, you would have a lot of complaints. But they just took it as what they had to do, and there were no issues. We had a guard on the site at night and over the weekends, especially when we had open units. And the final rule, which came from the Conservancy, which really values the trees in the park, was that we couldn't cut any roots that were bigger than 1/2 inch in diameter. So this is what it looked like on an early day. You can see we have a couple of excavation units open and a couple of screens, and people are doing various things. We screened all the dirt that came out of the test units. On the left, you see All Angels Church, and that was the name of the section where we began. We hadn't planned to begin there, but the Parks Department was having a concert. I think it was the Black Eyed Peas, and they were concerned about a lot of public being in the park, and so they asked us to start at the northernmost unit, transect, which was far away from their concert. So the first day, just below the ground surface, maybe 6 inches or so, we started finding rocks laid out in what looked like they could be linear transects. And you also can see here some of the roots. And I don't know if you can imagine what it would be like to have to dig in between those roots. You obviously couldn't use anything like a shovel. You had to use a little trowel, and it required a lot of patience. Also, you have to keep the walls very straight and square. So it was not really an easy project for the excavators. Anyway, let me go back, to that. What it turned out was that it was really a great thing that we started in this area, because these turned out to be walls from the home of one of Seneca Village's occupants, a man named William Godfrey Wilson, who was the sexton of the All Angels Church, which was very close to where his house was. And he lived in a fairly small house with his wife, Charlotte, and 9 children. It was about 19 by 21 feet. It had 3 floors. And just imagine living in that space with 11 people. This is what the house looked like when we were all finished. We had outlined where the walls were, which you can see outlined in brick. And we have 1 unit left open. And you can kind of see the faded squares where the other excavation units are. And what you see on the right is a map from above. The gray squares were excavation units, and the purple ones were something we called shovel tests, which didn't count in our 25 units. They were placed so that we could really find out where the walls of the house were. We did not excavate in all 6 of these quads that were designated the transects, but we looked for African Union Church, which is up there next to All Angels Church, and we did not find it, but we did excavate 3 other units, and this middle one is called Transect 3, and that was our next important excavation. And the ground penetrating radar had suggested that there was a house floor here. And so we were really interested in it. And when we started digging, and we started out with a 5 by 5 foot unit, and this is now has been extended, so it's the double length of one unit. But what you see in the middle that the radar had thought was a house floor is really a big stone, probably glacially deposited, and it was obviously had been in the village, but it was not part of a floor. But when we expanded the area in Transect 3, we found a number of units that were really part of the village. And what they were they were levels of floor, of ground, of actual ground that Seneca villagers walked on. And you could tell that they were ground because they were more compact than the surface above or below it. They were a slightly different color. When archaeologists are trying to distinguish one layer from another, they use the texture of the soil, the color of the soil, and this turned out to be a ground level that was found in quite a few of the test units in this area. And here you can see another test square, again with some of those roots. And you can see on the left a historic map that shows two of the houses that were in existence in Seneca Village. And what we think is that this was the backyard of two of those houses. And what supports that in a way was that the artifacts that we found in the Wilson house, which was the interior of the house, were quite different in some ways from the artifacts that we found in the backyard in Transect 3. And here are some of the artifacts that came from the Wilson house. Diana mentioned that we thought that this was a middle-class community. And I should say that the basis on which we made that assertion was a few things. One, from the documentary records, we could tell that Seneca villagers really believed in the power of education for their children. So a higher percentage of children in Seneca Village attended both grade school and, strikingly, high school, although there was no high school in the village, than did African American children who lived in the lower part of the city. So that children in Seneca Village who wanted to go to high school, or if their parents wanted them to go to high school, they would have to travel or stay with a relative or something to be able to acquire that education. So education is one criterion. Homeowning is a second, and Diana mentioned that people bought land because they were interested in voting, and also because perhaps they wanted to live in the village. And then the third was the presence of a moral community centered on the three churches in the school. So those were the basis of our saying it was probably a middle-class community. And then we looked at the artifacts to see if the artifacts supported that assertion. And what you see here on the lower left and lower right are some pieces of porcelain. Porcelain is an expensive ware, and that was found throughout Seneca Village in higher proportions than one might expect if you thought it was a really impoverished community. In the upper right and the dish right below that are what are called ironstone Gothic wares. And those are very characteristic of 19th century middle-class homes, both white and African American. The next slide shows you some artifacts. Oh no, here's a piece of Gothic ironstone plate. So you can see it has this molded rim with these segments in it. And then these are some artifacts from the Wilson house. In the middle on top is something that we think was part of horse gear. And we think that somebody in the village had a horse. There's a buckle down below. There's a fishing weight. There are some buttons. There's a spoon handle. So all of these are artifacts that give us some kind of ideas as to about what people in the village were doing, how they were making their living, the fact that they were somewhat self-sufficient in terms of, producing their own food. They probably fished in the river. There was a spring in the village that they could get water from, and they had fields that Diana talked about. And then this was the most exciting artifact, I think. And we found it in the Wilson house, and it's a child's shoe. And there's something very compelling about it, to think that that shoe actually was worn by a relatively small child who was part of the Wilson family house. And these are some of the artifacts from transect 3. And again, on the right, you see all of these pieces of molded ironstone. And on the left are some other different kinds of wares. In the middle is this beautiful teapot. And the teapot is made, well, first I'll talk about the other artifacts that were there that make it different from what was going on in the Wilson house. In the Wilson house, we found a lot of containers for domestic items, like, if you had beans or grains that you wanted to preserve, you put them in stoneware containers. But in the backyard deposit, we found smoking pipes, we found bottle glass, we found a lot more remains of meals. It looks to me a little bit like people were sitting in the backyard and maybe having a barbecue and smoking and having a drink. The artifact on the upper right was part of a spoon or fork. And then you can see a handle and another spoon. I want to talk a little bit about the teapot. It's a design that's called Florentine, but the thing that's interesting about it to us is that it's this light blue color, and it's a pattern it's a ware that's called transfer printed, which was made by overlaying the pattern. And what was interesting about the villagers' dishes was that many of them had these light blue on white dishes. They had them not only in this teapot, but in plates that they used in their homes. And we think that they did not have a matched set of dishes. We did some work comparing the ceramics from Seneca Village, which, as we've said, we thought was a middle-class African-American household, with some middle-class white households in Greenwich Village, and two backyard features from those areas show you the difference between the kinds of ceramics that were dominant. And in Seneca Village, this transfer print, circled in red, shows you that there were at least 60% of the wares were of this blue and white pattern, and they did not match with each other. And somebody who lived in Jamaica, who was part of the project, she had grown up there, and she said in her community, people had their own each person had their own dish. And so there would not be, matched sets of dishes. Whereas in white middle-class households, you are much more likely to expect to find that people had matched sets. And many of you may have grown up in a household where your plates matched cups, and everybody had the same plate and the same cup. But if you were descended from an enslaved population, sometimes the only kind of autonomy that you might have had would have been the choice in having your own dish. And so you couldn't have matched sets because it was important that everybody recognized his or her own plate. And that's why we think, hypothetically, that the dishes in Seneca Village did not match one another. We also looked at the frequency of small bowls between Seneca Village and between these white middle-class households. And the percentage of small bowls in Seneca Village was much higher, 40%, and in the village in Greenwich Village, it was only 25%. And that, we believe, may be part of the African heritage in cuisine, where soups and stews were an important part of what people's diet consisted of. And we think that that tradition carried down through generations of enslaved people to be represented in Seneca Village. We have lots of other ideas about the artifacts, but I think I should stop here and see if there are some questions, because I know you may have questions, and we could go on talking about Seneca Village forever. Okay, thank you.
We do have a couple questions for you, for both of you. And the first one, I know that I asked you this before we started this presentation, but our students would like to know, when did you first hear of Seneca Village? As a lot of them, the first time they've heard of Seneca Village was actually through social media. 60% of them first heard of Seneca Village through social media.
I first heard about it, I would think in the very late 80s, in a book by someone called Peter Salwin, talking about the history of the Upper West Side. He mentioned it almost in passing, and it was actually the Park and the People book that we mentioned before that gave a lot of background and really gave us a place to start to be able to find out more about it.
And then there was that exhibit at the Historical Society.
But that was like a few years later.
97.
Yeah.
But yeah, Cynthia Copeland curated an exhibit at the Historical Society that really presented Seneca Village.
Really? Was it, I believe I read somewhere, it was Cynthia Copeland that found pebbles or marbles, and that really reminded her of the children in the area?
I remember that she, of course we could ask her, but that she was taking a group of teachers out to the park, and they started to find, it had rained recently, and they found 19th century artifacts that they thought could have come from Seneca Village.
I think they were ceramics. I don't remember hearing about marbles, but they found things that were clearly part of a domestic household.
Wow, fascinating. Let's see. We had one person ask about an earlier slide that you had up, Nan. I guess it was the one with the roots that were over the stones.
Yeah.
And they were asking whether or not those could have been roads. I believe you mentioned something of that nature.
Whether the stones could have been roads? Mm-hmm. No, the stones were part of a wall, and the wall turned out to be part of the Wilson house. It turned out one of the structure walls. We see when they built the park, they didn't really put a lot of effort into destroying Seneca Village. They simply, I think people probably stole whatever lumber and nails and stuff they could have reused. But what they did was they just knocked down whatever was left. We found lots of pieces of tin roofing, and we found these foundation walls. And so that's really how we knew it was a structure.
Okay. Next question is, how difficult was it to find those living in Seneca Village using the, I believe it was 1855 census?
We had a map that we could go back and forth to, the Gardner Sage map. And the Gardner Sage map was a map that told you who owned the different properties and who was living in the various houses. So that allowed you to go back to the census and say, oh, look, there's William Godfrey Wilson. Here he is listed, shown on this map. And look, there he is in the census. So we can plot where he lived on the ground.
But if what you mean is, did we find any descendants? Is that what the question?
I believe that's a question.
Oh, sorry.
We had a very, very hard time finding descendants, and we were really upset about that. And at the end of the exhibit that Cynthia and Grady Turner put on, there was a list of all of the people who had lived in the village, and it asked anybody who had been to the exhibit to identify any ancestors. And I think maybe one Irish descendant came forth, but for years and years we could not find any descendants. And then about 5 years ago, through social media, a young woman contacted us who was descended from a family called Williams, who were also early settlers and the early residents of the park. And her family has been interested in genealogy. So she's the first person that we have a direct connection to. And I personally think that part of the reason it was so hard to find descendants is that because the landscape was destroyed. And so it just makes it that much harder to, feel a connection to a place if everything about it is gone and looks different.
And I guess touching on that point, with everything being gone in that area, I feel that they would have perhaps stayed in the surrounding parts, especially if you have like your sense of community. This may be a bit of an ignorant question, but with your community, wouldn't you migrate just outside of where your previous community was?
You're asking, did people stay nearby after they had to move from Seneca Village?
Right.
The Wilsons followed All Angels Church, which moved over to West End Avenue, and they lived over near the church. He continued to be the sexton of the church. But there are other people who, some of them moved to Astoria, Queens, some of them moved down to what is today Soho, all over. The community itself was gone. In other words, there was no nucleus of people from Seneca Village who lived close to each other anymore.
Gotcha. Well, I think that's all of the questions we have so far.
Okay.
So we're ready for you, man.
You ready for me to do what?
I wasn't sure if you were finished with your presentation.
Oh, yes, I was. Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
But, we can talk about it for quite a long time. One of the things that has been very pleasing to us is that Seneca Village is becoming more widely known. You said you heard about it in 2019, and that's not atypical, but there are some artists. There's a playwright, a poet, a couple of poets, photographers, and other kinds of artists. A woman who's done textiles that she thinks she's designed clothing that she thinks people in Seneca Village, women in Seneca Village, might have worn. So the idea of Seneca Village is gradually catching on, I think, particularly among African American artists. And so it's becoming spread through a variety of means that we hadn't anticipated. There's a filmmaker. There's now going to be a period room at the Met Museum that's based on a kitchen in Seneca Village, an Afro-futuristic room that is going to involve some of the artifacts that might have been in Seneca Village, but presented in a much more contemporary vein. So I think it's really getting accelerated, the knowledge of Seneca Village, and our goal, and certainly Cynthia as an educator has always had this goal to introduce Seneca Village into the New York City grade school curriculum. People know that there were African Americans in the 19th century. They don't know that there were very many in New York, and they don't know that in addition to being it's important to know whether they were free or enslaved, but within the category of free African Americans, there were differences there among people who lived a middle class way of life and people who lived a more working class way of life. And I think that's really important to sort of develop the grain of knowledge about, all kinds of people in the past.
I guess another question that I would have is, when you guys were kind of sifting through the land, so to speak, were there any sorts of currencies that were found? Because I guess at the time, my question would be, how would they get the clothes that they would wear outside of making it themselves, or maybe trading with, someone from the Celtic or other communities in the area? So I know that there were clothes and plates and bowls found, but how about just common currency?
You mean money?
Yeah.
We did find a $2 piece that came from, we think, under the floorboards in the Wilson house. It's like someone dropped it and never found it again. And then we came along 150 years later and found it.
But it was a little tiny coin, and we think it was printed or coined because it was the price of a stamp. And so some people said, well, this was the kind of coin that people used to buy stamps. But, there are, one of the stories that has been made up about Seneca Village was that some of the women worked as domestics. And that they might get clothing from some of their employers. I mean, that's in one of the children's books that somebody has written about Seneca Village. And so I'm sure they would have made some of their own, and they would have bartered, and but they also could have received some as gifts from people or in exchange for services, things like that.
Right. I know that you noticed.
But that was our only coin.
The only coin, really? So another question I have is, why, how can I pose this? So in this area, there were 3 schools and a church, if I'm not mistaken.
3 churches and a school.
3 churches and a school. So it's just hard to understand how there's just no, books anywhere, or even just the spine of something left from.
All Angels Church does have records of Seneca Village.
But no physical.
The church that still exists that moved over to West End Avenue.
Right, but just even pencils or pens or books or things like that for these schools.
We have slate pencils.
Really?
But they would have used a slate and a pencil made of slate for their schoolwork.
Wow. All right.
Yeah.
So I guess, I don't know, what else would you like to share about Seneca Village? I have plenty of questions, so I don't mind picking your brains. But
well, we're interested in your questions. So.
Well, I guess at the time, because there was one slide that you had up, Nan, I believe, that it was a piece of a horse and buggy.
Mm-hmm. A part of a bridle. Yeah.
A bridle.
No, bridle.
Bridle. Gotcha. Sorry.
Okay.
So I guess, do you believe that that's how everyone sort of got around back then? Because there was no subway system, and I think a lot of people need to understand.
There were trolleys, however.
There were trolleys.
And buses, yeah.
Got it.
But it probably didn't come up that far, did they?
Well, they did come up that far, but they were expensive, so they might have walked.
I think people probably walked.
Yeah.
They were 2 or 3 miles from the edge of the settled city. That's not too far to walk, right?
But then you have to walk into it, which could be another
right.
mile and then home again.
Yes.
That's true. Let's see. I don't know. Is there anything else that you two would love to share?
I think it's kind of hard to picture how wonderful a place this must have been for African Americans. I mean, the city as a whole was a very racist place. And up in Seneca Village, I think it must have felt very comfortable. I think it was really a tragedy that they were dislocated because I think it must have been a lovely place to live and a very harmonious place to live. I mean, once again, in one of these children's books, there's a story about a friendship between an African American girl and an Irish girl. We don't know that they were friends. But we have no evidence that they were not. And in All Angels Church, there are records of interracial marriage, interracial godparents, or witnesses at a wedding. So that implies a degree of harmony that you might not expect if you think about the 19th century and Irish and African Americans in other settings where they didn't get along.
Very true. We had a question come in from Bill Ty. I hope he's still around. And his question was that he was reading about Central Park, and that soon after everyone was sort of sent out of Central Park, that their goal for it sort of dwindled because it was seen as being this place for outdoor activities and being free to walk around outside. But all of all those hopes and dreams were dashed for about 80 years. And Seneca Village actually fought for 2 years to stay in that area. And so would either of you have any more detail about that? Because it wasn't really posted as a full question. But.
Well, I mean, we know that the villagers didn't want to leave because there are documents that show that they were all compensated for their land, but many of them protested that compensation. And so they said, I was offered much more for this house, 3 years ago. But the other component that you may be talking about is that, when the park was planned, it was thought to be a park for everybody. And yet when it opened, it wasn't. It was a park for the elite to ride around with their carriages and horses and show off, their fancy carriages and their fancy clothes. And it only became a park for the people much later on.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. The working class people were not really encouraged to go there at the beginning.
Got
or
it.
maybe they didn't feel welcome. I'm not sure that there was any official policy, but I think they did not go.
I figure maybe, perhaps I feel that it would be more just towards feeling welcome than anything else.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting that you found, or that, bowls were found, because I'm barely first generation American, and I know that we eat a lot of soups. If not, I want to say like 9 out of 10 meals are soups. So it can range from very hearty soups or very thin soups, but it's definitely soups. So it's interesting that bowls were the majority of utensils found.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you're confirming that.
Well, I mean, I guess if we don't have any other questions, we had a bit of connectivity issue at the beginning. And let's see, we have a Dr. Gray that would like to speak, but I don't believe he's here still. Now I'm drawing a blank with all the questions that I had for you, and I don't want to end this just yet, but if some of the people that we have don't have any other questions, I guess we'll have to end it. And so we'll give them a minute for that. And then I also have a video that I found that PBS did a special on Seneca Village. I'm not sure if either of you are familiar with this one.
When was it made?
That is a great question. I actually have it here, if you don't mind.
About 3 years ago, I think. It's the one that was part of a series.
Fairly recent, yes. And so I'm going to go ahead and play this here. Let's see.
When we look at what it takes to be an American, I think you find no better example than right here in New York with its own free Black communities, in which they defined what it meant to be an American, even when the law and the government did not see them as such. One of the first free Black communities in New York is Seneca Village. Founded in 1825, and that, of course, is pre-emancipation. We're talking about New York specifically. Slavery ends in New York in 1827.
So a group of African Americans who were affiliated with the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, they were the first to buy property in this area that became known as Seneca Village.
Daily life in Seneca Village would have been impacted by racial violence on a daily basis. They lived in an integrated community, so while it was a free Black community, they had among them Irish neighbors and some German neighbors too, and they intentionally placed themselves there.
Seneca Village comprised approximately 70 buildings. There was 3 churches. The first church to be created was the African Union Church. This church also did have a school, and it was one of the few schools that was available for African American students. So it helps us understand Seneca Village as a place where community and church and education was very important.
I would say one of the more famous residents, if you will, was Albro Lyons. He actually lived in Lower Manhattan during the draft riots. And his daughter, Maritza, who was a teenager at the time, she's the one who left her memoirs and really explained the horror that happened in Manhattan streets during the summer of 1863, when African Americans were basically being tortured and murdered by their fellow New Yorkers. In 1855, when the city starts thinking about a public space that will be called Central Park, they decide that Seneca Village has no value and said we would have more value if we became a public space, and we will call that public space Central Park. Of course, it really had nothing to do with that community or upholding what that community stood for.
You know, it was about 800 acres of land, and while it was not the first example of the use of eminent domain, it was certainly a prominent example. But it is certain that, you know, the creation of the park did really disrupt the development of what was one of the city's most important African-American communities.
Within 30 years, Seneca Village is basically established, thrives, and evaporates completely.
So there are not a lot of physical traces of Seneca Village in the landscape. Since about 1997, a group of historians and archaeologists have been studying Seneca Village.
You know, we found more portraits and illustrations, and we found a map that actually had the names of individuals that we didn't know that was in our collection, that helped us to understand, oh, this is why these people are there. And then from there, those names on the map, we could connect to the census records, and then we could find out for sure that these were actually black folk and white folk, and they actually owned their property. They weren't squatters. And so it was just telling a different kind of story.
They found such magical things that I think tell a story of a really dignified, thriving African-American community. It's through their efforts that we know so much more about Seneca Village.
We collected these things and we tried to interpret them to see if they dated to the period of Seneca Village, and so they did. And you look at the newspapers, you look at the maps, you look at the title deeds, you look at family papers, and you just kind of piece that together like, okay, so this is telling an interesting story. How can we bolster this story? How can we humanize it a little bit more?
There's no descendants that have been found from Seneca Village, and it's not from lack of trying. My suspicion is to do with the amount of time that Seneca Village existed for. It existed through to 1855-57. For whatever reason, like so many things in history, we lose them to the archives, but not for lack of trying.
We are in a search. We're on a hunt to try to find direct descendants who are connected to the story, because again, it's just one of those things that will humanize and, you know, put a nice punctuation mark, an exclamation at the end of the story.
If you look at the history and the rediscovery of Seneca Village, there is a pattern here. And the pattern is this: the city always erases history. That's what it does. It does so in the name of New York, in the name of progress. But I think it's really important that ordinary people, ordinary New Yorkers, ordinary Americans understand that it's always been other ordinary Americans who have preserved their own communities, even if it means forgetting about that community and then rediscovering them again decades later.
Yeah, so I saw a few of your artifacts in there.
Right.
But I guess looking forward into 2021 and onwards, what other projects what do you plan on doing with the Seneca Village project or any other projects?
Diana, do you want to talk about that? Or shall we talk about the book we're going to write?
I think you're muted.
Is that better?
Yeah.
What Nan and I are planning to do is to write a book about our project and Seneca Village. And our idea is always to draw more attention to Seneca Village itself, so that it becomes part of our consciousness of the city's history, and not something that's special or unique, but something that's important and integral to the city's history.
But, you know, there are other middle-class African-American communities that have been found around the United States. So there is a growing
Absolutely, yeah.
Boston, one in Annapolis, one in
Weeksville in Brooklyn.
Weeksville in Brooklyn, right? Sacramento, California, New Philadelphia. So there's beginning to be, you know, quite a few of them. And I think that, I mean, we're not planning on going back and doing any more excavation, although there may well be things to excavate because they have done some more radar and they've identified some other possibilities, but maybe somebody will. And the Conservancy has gotten very interested in Seneca Village and has a website. And so it is becoming more widely known. And that's really, I think, what's important to us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now you're muted.
I guess I was saying that I'm definitely passionate about more people finding out about Seneca Village and the other areas and other major cities that you've mentioned just now. But without any other questions that are coming in, again, I think it's due to a connectivity issue. I see a few things in the chat. But Diana and Nan, I can't thank you both enough for joining us for this presentation and all of the information that you've shared. I'm sure we'll get a few emails about questions once they either see the recap or anything like that. And I would definitely love it if we could email you those questions so we could get some answers for our students and everyone watching.
What would be nice for us is if we could get copies of the questions, because as I said, we're writing this book and it would be nice to know what people are interested in.
Definitely. I'll send you an entire list of all the questions from like Facebook and WebinarJam and LinkedIn.
That would be great.
All right, definitely.
Thanks so much.
Thank you guys again. Have an amazing rest of your week.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.